For our next discussion, we are honored to welcome back to the Exchange Ann Neuberger, Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, in conversation with Dr. Joseph Nye, Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor, to discuss securing the nation through emerging technologies.
Welcome, Ann, back to Cambridge, even if it's only virtual. But we want to thank you for taking the time. You and I were on the phone a couple of days ago. I got the impression you had a few other things on your desk. So thank you for sparing this time for us. As you look back on your striking career, where you've had a major leadership role in cyber, even before you became a White House Deputy National Security Advisor and Assistant to the President, you were a Chief Risk Officer at NSA in the aftermath of the infamous Snowden incident of 2013. And you also were in charge of NSA's cybersecurity. So there's a lot that you had to do in leading. And I wonder, before we plunge into the details of cyber, if you could say a little bit about what lessons you would give us here, which is a group, as you know, interested in leadership and innovations for national security. What would you say are the 2 or 3 major things you've learned over that stellar career?
First, it's very kind of you. It was wonderful to be here with you personally. You're somebody who's taught all of us so much in terms of how to think about national security, how to think about securing the nation with emerging technologies through national security. So it's wonderful to do this, and as you would imagine, it's a busy weekend and time, so I appreciate the opportunity to do this virtually. Even more so because it's SCSP, and it's a tribute to Dr. Ash Carter, who, for all of us who seek to drive change in the national security mission we love, Dr. Carter really set an example. And he set an example in really 3 ways. One, in the love he brought to the national security mission, and that love drove the impatience for change to ensure the mission could stay constant and evolving with the agility needed to ensure the U.S. stayed safe. And second, he loved technology. And the combination of mission and technology was game-changing. And to your point, I watched that firsthand during the counter-ISIS period when he turned to us at the National Security Agency and Cyber Command and said, okay, what will offensive cyber capabilities do in our counter-ISIS fight? Bring it to the front. And he really pressed hard to see that set of technologies come to that critical national security mission. So to answer your question, in terms of what I've learned, so much of what I learned were the things that Dr. Carter taught, which is why it's so nice to be here with you today. And thank you again for so warmly welcoming me here. And I think what I would say, in terms of that mission, is that technology has long shaped national security as much as geography or demography. And we see how those advances in technology, particularly because many of them are dual use, and cyber is a great example, where both, when we think about using cyber capabilities for offense, at the same time we have to be defending ourselves against adversarial use and ensuring that we're using technology for our own national defense. So it's important when we think about change to really think across that continuum and bring that love of mission, bring that love of technology, and understand that when we think about the risks of new technology, we have to balance the risk of doing and the risk of not doing. And I think that's at the crux of change in large organizations like government, where we have new technologies. And sometimes we wait till we can have fully built out risk models. But then we miss the space and of doing. So that key part of change, which is to say, how much do we need to know to act? And if there's a lot that we don't know, what can we get done today? What mission needs those critical changes? Because there are benefits on that side, and watch it and iterate.
Well, that's great. But you mentioned Ash's important leadership. He also was critical in starting Cyber Command and setting it up to deal with ISIS in the Middle East. Can you say a little bit about how you saw that from your perspective, offensive?
Very much so. So at the time that Ash was driving that change, I was the deputy head of NSA's intelligence operations. And Cyber Command had been stood up just 5, 6 years before. And there's a natural tension between intelligence and military use of cyberspace. Intelligence goal is to be collecting on targets. And ideally, many targets don't change. Heads of state, military units. So the intelligence goal is to be collecting and collecting for a long time. From a military perspective, and this preceded cyber, from a military perspective, there's a desire to use intelligence to have some effect, to have some impact, whether it's a kinetic strike or whether it's an offensive cyber strike. And as a result, the reason that there is one commander for NSA and Cyber Command was because there was a recognition that they operate in the same cyberspace, and there needed to be that integrated coordination. But there was a lot of tension between the two sets of goals, and they were viewed as competing goals. And what Ash drove was to say, we need to win on both, and we need to make 1 + 1 = 3. NSA, using its advanced abilities to gain access to intelligence targets, have to open a second door for Cyber Command to get the intelligence it needs to conduct its impactful offensive cyber operations. And Cyber Command has to ensure that they don't put core intelligence accesses at risk. So at the time, I was the deputy head of intelligence operations, and my job at the time, the director of NSA was the commander of Cyber Command, put me in charge of driving that change at NSA. And it really was to say, ISIS is a real challenge for us. Of course we need to be collecting intelligence on who are the key people at ISIS, what are the techniques they do, where's the next attack. But we also want Cyber Command to be disrupting their communications, to be degrading the ability for a commander to talk to units and give orders, because then they're forced to use slower communications. They're forced to use those that the intelligence community can compromise. So he really drove that partnership to make the two communities see benefit from each other and move quickly together.
Well, as you can imagine, we've had a fair amount of discussion this morning about artificial intelligence when we're talking about innovation. Avril Haines was here with us and talked about the impact on the intelligence community. When you think about offense and defense in cybersecurity, what's the net impact of AI? I mean, there are some people, for example, who say that, well, when AI writes code, there'll be very, very few bugs for the bad people to exploit. Other people say yes, but when the bad people get access to AI, they'll find those few bugs and exploit them. What's the net assessment that you have of the effect of AI on cybersecurity?
Artificial intelligence is dual use, as you are exactly right. It helps on offense, it helps on defense. Defense is a far harder mission because defense has to be watching every door and window. Offense has to be getting into one, whether it's an electronic warfare attack or whether it is a cyber attack. So I think net AI can help us more on defense. And you gave a few examples of how. One is our entire economies, our militaries, everything runs on code. Today, 40% of code being generated is generated by AI. The problem with that is it's being generated off existing code. Microsoft Copilot leverages GitHub, existing code bases. And we know the problem with existing code bases, they're not secure enough. So what we need to do is ensure that AI models are not just trained on existing code bases, but are augmented with training them on known vulnerabilities, known adversarial techniques, as well as more secure code to enable them to then ideally not only find vulnerabilities from known adversarial techniques, but help prevent other ones, and then accelerate patching and deployment. So I truly see the opportunity for AI to help more on defense, both in that area In some, today's cyber defense is an often boring manual job. There's more alerts that there are people to look at them. It's hard to know what's the baseline of good on a given network. I was talking recently to some telecom executives as we faced a number of telecom threats, and they talked about how telecom networks are entirely software today. So understanding what the known base of what's normal to determine what's an anomalous activity, what's an adversary, what's China taking data out of a national telecom network, it's hard to know because it's hard to know an anomalous activity to detect it. That's where AI can be game-changing. And we have a number of efforts across the national security community, a number of efforts in partnership with the private sector to go after that.
Well, that's very helpful. Are there other dimensions of AI that you think are going to change your world besides the offense-defense balance and looking for anomalies? Is there anything else in there?
There's more in there. Let's look at the area of electronic warfare. What we're seeing today is the changing contours of the battlefield and of battle. When we look at Ukraine, for example, we see Ukraine using drones that are in the realm of $10,000 to disable weapons platforms that cost orders of magnitude more. Similarly, we see the Russians conducting jamming attacks that cost small sums of money against precision targeting from U.S. military capabilities. So it's fundamentally changing the asymmetry of battle in terms of cost and in terms of how advanced military platforms can potentially be disabled or degraded. That's happening because so much of technology is moved to software, and that's driving defense and offense to be continuous and much more rapid. So, when we thought decades ago about submarine detection capability and submarine capabilities, we were always on a continuum. As soon as the U.S. made advances in submarine navigation and hiding ourselves in submarine warfare, we'd always be ensuring that we built that into our own defenses, to ensure that we could also defend against an adversary who may be making the same R&D advancements, who may be making the same offensive advancements. And I think AI is now leveling on those dual use capabilities. I'll talk about another few examples, which is forcing change in the way battles are happening. So, for example, electronic warfare defenses, instead of taking months, have to move to minutes. Instead of taking months from the time we may see a new radar signal and build that into a plane, knowing that signal, knowing that to defend against it needs to take moments. And that will drive change in where software engineers are deployed, what's done autonomously, to ensure that we can project power and also defend in the most effective way.
So not only will AI affect the balance of offense and defense in terms of cybersecurity, but it will affect our ability to deal with electronic warfare on the battlefield. Those are terribly important. What about the larger picture of deterrence in cyber? In other words, you and I have talked about this a number of times before, and you've recently written this very nice short piece on deterrence in cyber security. Tell us a little bit about deterrence.
I think the more accurate way to say, you and I talked about it, is you really talked and a great deal about deterrence. So thank you for those conversations over the years. At the beginning, I think people often looked at deterrence in cyberspace the way perhaps we looked at deterrence in the nuclear arena. High-end, nation-on-nation capabilities that we could deter with a cyber version of mutually assured destruction. And I think what's evolved over the last 10 years is a recognition that in many ways it's quite the opposite. In cyberspace, there are many different kinds of actors, from countries to criminals to hacktivists to folks who move through the gray zone. There is readily available offensive cyber capabilities, whether it's ransomware attack tools, to just commercially available tools. And it's far harder to identify who the attacker is. You know, in some cases we've seen Russia use Iranian covert infrastructure and tools. We've seen countries use criminal offensive cyber capabilities and tools. And since the first step of deterrence is really knowing who the attacker is that attribution, is that identification, it's far harder in cyberspace, which makes the deterrence model in cyberspace very, very difficult. And there's a number of steps President Biden, my administration has taken to try to build additional deterrence, which I'm happy to talk about.
Thinking about deterrence, we usually think of deterring another state. But as you mentioned, when we look at non-state actors, it's much harder to think of deterrence. We had a very interesting talk here at Harvard yesterday about the future of ransomware, which has now become quite professionalized. We're talking about not the $100 of Bitcoin, but hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in ransomware, attacking not just a few businesses, but hospitals and so forth. So the thing I found discouraging about this talk was the prediction that it's going to get worse, not better. How do we deter it when we're dealing with something like that?
Ransomware is the most disruptive set of actions in cyberspace today. Around the world, in any given week, there are hospitals turning away ambulances because the hospital networks have been encrypted. We saw in the United States, pipelines, ports, city police, the Dallas police, the disabling of their networks, and hence the ability to cooperate, to communicate. You know, you had Dallas police cars and policemen and women who were taking manual records or had no way to call back and see somebody they pulled over, somebody to be concerned about. So ransomware is having a broadly disruptive impact around the world. Around half of the attacks occurring in the last year were against the United States, largely because we have so much infrastructure, so much unsecure infrastructure, and because victims in the United States continue to pay ransoms. We also have the largest ransom payment ever made, $75 million roughly, in the last few months. So in terms of deterrence, we've looked at deterrence in two core ways, actually three core ways. One has President Biden has signed off on the first ever minimum mandated cybersecurity. To say, much as we have minimum mandates for the safety of railroads, you know, in the old analog space, we have to have that from a cybersecurity perspective. So that's been put in place sector by sector through regulators to lift up the level of security, to make it harder for attackers. And that's an ongoing journey, as you would expect. But now, for the first time, there are minimum mandates and new regulators who are actually checking in and inspecting the most important critical infrastructure. The second have been the partnerships. So cyberspace attackers know no borders. There could be attackers in one set of countries using infrastructure or a whole other set of countries to disrupt a hospital or a pipeline or a police system in a third set of countries. So the Biden administration built an international partnership with 68 countries called the Counter-Ransomware Initiative, where countries can share information, share techniques that they see attackers using. We're trying to get to where we can share bad wallets, where ransom payments are made so that financial networks around the world can block those crypto wallets as well. That's the next stage of sharing we're working to get to. And that international cooperation is the modern version of the kind of international cooperation built in other places to counter transnational threats. And then the final piece has been really increasing the number of attributions. And doing so with as many partners as possible to try to create that same deterrence model, Joe, that you've talked about in so many other spaces, in so many other threat areas. Prior to 2021, there were only 4 public attributions by countries other than the United States and UK to Russia or China. Since 2021, there have been 8 with a broad swath of European and more recently Asian partners. Because they're recognizing that that first attribution, the publicly saying this was Russia, this was China, or in one case, this is Iran, is the first step to creating deterrence. We then get to the harder question, which is how do you create consequences, and what are appropriate consequences for example, Russia providing safe haven to a group of criminals that disables a hospital around the world. What is the appropriate consequence for that? And that's where the real policy gaps and work needs to be done.
Well, that is interesting because you mentioned international cooperation, and for a number of years there's a UN group of government experts which brought out a set of principles of not interfering with critical infrastructure, civilian critical infrastructure. I think it was in 2015. Then it was reinforced by the open-ended working group at the UN. But what intrigues me is that after the Russians signed in 2015 these group of government expert principles, they then went and attacked Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Is there a role for norms? In others, when we're talking about deterrence, how much does international cooperation help on this? We can say, well, if there are norms, it allows you to name and shame the violators. But it seems like in this case, the Russians are shameless. What do we do in a case like that?
That's exactly the question to ask. So the first step is the naming, the second step is the shaming. And there's been so at that time in 2015, and you recall at the time the NotPetya attacks that also, the Russian attacks that spread and had massive billions of dollars of impact around the world. At the time, only the US and the UK were willing to attribute that to Russia. Other countries were hesitant because they were afraid of retaliation. The knowledge that Russia has one of the most advanced defensive cyber programs, and a concern that Russia would then attack them in cyberspace. So I think what's changed the most since then, and even more so since 2021, and Russia's later invasion of Ukraine, has been a greater willingness to name Russia and to say yes, while we may be afraid of retaliation, Russia's already conducting this wide swath of activity in cyberspace, either directly or through Russian-aligned activists, Russian intelligence service working with criminal actors like ransomware actors. So more countries have been willing to name, and to a certain case shame, in terms of designating some of the companies, Russia and China for that matter, used to conduct their cyber attacks. Or another thing, which is take Russian capabilities that are collected in intelligence and share them with the cybersecurity community to essentially take them off the table. Some of that's done through quiet networks, again, to enable the cybersecurity companies to defend broadly against capabilities and take them out of the Russian toolbox. So that's been some of what's evolved in the last number of years, and it's why people often think about offensive cyber capabilities and national cybersecurity as two different things. They're fundamentally connected, both in a country's willingness, our willingness to use offensive cyber capabilities in a crisis or conflict is directly tied to how confident we feel that if there was retaliation, our critical systems and services were resilient enough to continue operating. So the work on national cybersecurity, the minimum cybersecurity requirements, the work with partners around the world, is fundamental to achieving the shaming piece you talked about.
Sticking with Russia for a minute, I gather that when President Biden met with President Putin in Geneva in 2021, I guess it was, June or so, that he raised this issue of ransomware with Putin and told him that we treated it as a real security threat. And that the net result of that was shortly afterwards, several of the cyber criminal groups were practicing the ransomware in Russia were arrested and their sites were taken down. But obviously that didn't last, and with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that type of prospect or of cooperation seems even less. But to what extent can we get hold of some of these non-state actors by getting cooperation from another country, particularly if it's an adversarial country?
You know, I'll share a story for a moment. So after President Biden met President Putin, they stood up what they called an expert group for the U.S. and Russia to discuss exactly as you said, President Biden's discussion with President Putin, which was to say, these are not, separate criminals. These are criminals operating out of Russia, and you need to take care of them because under, as you put it, the UN's GGE norms, each country is required to do due diligence on attacks coming out of their IP space, coming out of their country. So President Biden and President Putin stood up this Russia experts group. And as I mentioned this, I spent 15 years in the intelligence community. I've been running NSA's intelligence operations, and we were the first time the BTC comes up at this U.S. government meeting. I had a counterpart, a general in the Kremlin, and the BTC comes up, and there's this white painted wood with gilt, and a circle of with a lot of gilt on it, and a circle of men, and it. For me, for a moment, my thought was, oh, I'm accustomed to collecting all these people, not talking to them. It was just one of those moments and certainly then when we did the next step, which was do as President Biden had committed and share the details of the individuals in Russia who had conducted the attack on the colonial pipeline as part of making the case that, yes, they were in Russia, yes, they used Russian IP space. And it did drive a set of action, as you noted, and the war in Ukraine clearly changed the game in that way. The question of how the broader international community addresses non-state actors who are conducting attacks in cyberspace, which knows no borders, is one of the toughest ones we're focused on. And we're clear-eyed about getting cooperation from countries like Russia or like Iran. And that's why, the toolbox the U.S. has been developing expanded. So for example, the State Department has something called the Rewards for Justice program, where they will name individuals. It's been used in Iran, for example, to name members of Iran's CEC, the Iranian military cyber command entity that conducts cyber attacks around the world, names them, and gives a reward for justice, for information to bring them to justice. And we've seen that, in countries, those individuals don't like being named. They're concerned that they won't be able to travel. They're concerned that they'll face other kinds of cyber attacks on themselves, etc. So there have been ways that we've had to creatively think, given it's difficult to physically bring those individuals to justice, ways to make it riskier, costlier, and harder, and to try to make them see that there's costs from this work and not want to do it. We're clear-eyed, though, about the challenges because the way the international community works fundamentally is as countries who are accountable for their actions, and it's harder in this space when these actors are non-state, or in many cases, non-state but provided safe haven, encouragement, or help in some cases by specific governments like Russia, like Iran.
Switching from Russia to China, what do we do with the problem of implants in our grid, for example? It's published in the press that China has put implants in our grid to be used in the case of a crisis. I guess this is called Volt Typhoon, is the latest version of this. But as you pointed out, and we know, the rules that were agreed in the UN prohibit the use of interfering with a critical infrastructure. They don't prohibit implanting something that might be suddenly turned on in a crisis. What do we do with that?
As we think about securing the nation through emerging technologies, this question you're asking is one of the toughest ones we are working on. Because there's a fundamental asymmetry between the US and Chinese models. both of our economies ride on digital infrastructure. Our electricity systems, our water systems, our militaries, and everyday communications. But China has a great firewall. China monitors all of its domestic communications. So it's far easier for China to find and pause any kind of offensive cyber activity from outside the country to reach China. In the United States, as you know, the US government doesn't monitor domestic networks. And almost 100% of critical networks, power, water, pipelines, telecom, are privately owned. So the US government has been working closely with companies around the United States to share techniques. I mentioned the minimum cybersecurity work, and to bring small groups of companies in to really build and deepen the resilience of digital infrastructure. To your point, pre-positioning, as China has been doing in US and frankly partner critical infrastructure around the world, notably in the Indo-Pacific, does not violate the norm. However, and this is a conversation we've had at very senior levels with the Chinese government, when we find Chinese capabilities pre-positioned in a water system, we do not see any intelligence value to China. So we must infer, then, that the purpose is pre-positioning to disable the ability of those water systems to operate during a crisis, to put pressure, to potentially put pressure on a society, on a government, in a time of crisis. That's unacceptable. We will continue to pursue and do everything we can to evict you from our critical networks. And this is destabilizing in the relationship, and if necessary, will respond not only in cyberspace. And these are difficult conversations, and our strategy has been, first and above all, make ourselves a harder target. We need to make it much harder for the Chinese, and that's where I lift up the work of agencies like TSA, like EPA, like CISA, in sharing cybersecurity advice. And we also have started doing sensitive operations around the world to take down the infrastructure, patch the infrastructure between China and the United States. Globally, that covert infrastructure, again, working with partners around the world to make it harder for the Chinese to conduct these kind of operations. But we're clear-eyed about the challenge because it is much easier on offense than on defense. So our response has to be multifaceted, all the way from hardening our own networks to taking down things in space, to build relationships, and also make clear to the Chinese that, if necessary, we will consider a cyber attack on the homeland as the equivalent of, in terms of impact, if it has physical impact, as if it was a kinetic.
And we're running low on time, but I would be derelict in duty if I didn't at least raise the question of elections, since this 2024 is known as the year of elections, and there's even one coming up soon around here. I know you can't get into the details of what we're doing now or the details of American elections at this point, but we've seen, a number of interferences, Russia and Moldova and Georgia, China and Taiwan and so forth. How serious is the danger or the threat of interference in elections? I was intrigued by the SCSP had a very nice interview that Jean Meserve did with General Nakasone, and he said they don't want to overrate this. It's a real problem, but not to overrate. How do you see the election problem?
So the integrity of our elections in a democracy is the highest priority for us. It's the core of who we are. As you said, from the White House, the responsible agencies for U.S. election security are CISA. There are centers stood up at CISA, at FBI, at the Office of Director of National Intelligence, partnering closely, ensuring that threats that we see, whether foreign or domestic, are actioned quickly. And as you've heard many, from the CISA director to Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, they've talked in detail both about threats and their confidence in and the work done to secure the US election. So I'll talk about around the world. So as we look around the world, we certainly see Russia putting the focus, whether in Moldova, in Georgia, because they see it as a way to put individuals who may have interests aligned with Russia into political positions. We certainly see other countries putting a big focus on disinformation and elections influence as well. And there's a role for governments, there's a role for social media platforms in putting the focus on finding and educating broader populations to counter that.
Well, and you have given us a tremendous tour of the world and tour of technologies. As a final shot, is there any particular technology on the horizon that worries you? For example, earlier today, somebody mentioned quantum computing, what that would do to encryption. There may be other things that keep you up at night. As our final alert or warning, anything you particularly like to leave us with?
I think noting quantum is an important one because encryption is the root of the way we secure our financial transactions, our economies, the way we secure our ability for our military communications and our satellites to communicate. And a quantum computer could potentially break the root math at the core of that. We think we're a decade away from that, but certainly preparing to roll out a new generation of cryptography. I would say, more than any specific technology, as we talked about, countries that adapted and adopted technology rapidly, technology as important as geography and demography in terms of countries projecting power. From a national security perspective, new technologies bring with them new legal challenges, new areas of policy, culture, and change, and how we drive change in our national security community. So the biggest risk is that we don't adopt fast enough within our own missions. So recognizing, coming back to that first question, risk of doing and risk of not doing, leaning forward to use these technologies in our missions, whether they're to accelerate intelligence, the generation of strategic intelligence or tactical intelligence across the different forms of int. So achieving the vision of bringing our intelligence community together in a more unified, integrated way, independent of how intelligence was collected.
Well, I say those are perfect final words for this conference. And we're deeply grateful to you for taking this time to share them with us. And now please go back and protect us.
Thank you so much. Great to be here with you and you.
That